Welcome to the Artistic Foodies, the show that explores life through the lens of art and food. I'm Abbas Mohamed,
And I'm Irfan Rydhan.
and today we're talking about halal certification with Jalel and Tariq of the Islamic Services of America, a major certifier and educator in the global halal industry. We take a deep dive into halal certification, the complexities involved in creating halal standards, and even broach new topics of discussion, including lab grown meat and cannabis. Jalel Aossey is the current president of the Islamic Services of America, ISA. He's been leading as an experienced executive in both domestic and international halal industry markets. He has presented halal topics at a number of international food shows and conferences, and he writes, "My guiding philosophy in business and life: hold true to your faith and character during the trials and hardships of life. For no matter the trial, it is only temporary if you believe and strive toward a better future ahead." We are also joined by Tariq Igram, who is the Director of Sharia and Marketing for ISA in Cedar Rapids, where he was born. After earning a bachelor's in business administration, he was then very blessed to receive a scholarship from the Islamic University of Al Madinah Al Munawwara in Saudi Arabia, where he completed a bachelor's, master's, and PhD in Sharia, Islamic law. One of his active roles at ISA is to constantly be up to date with the most recent halal issues and trends in the industry, as well as marketing trends, training, and educating all the halal client applications through ISA. Why do you do what you do? What got you into this? How long have you been doing it, and why did you get into it, and why are you still doing this? What is your motivations?
So that's the beginning stage. I've got the easiest answer for you, and it starts off with my first introduction to your podcast when I was driving. I can't remember. I think I was driving back to Iowa or somewhere, and I had been looking online, and I saw your podcast, and someone, I don't remember which one it was, but someone was making the comment about when they were at school and they were asking if there was any meat in the gravy. And I just started laughing out loud on the car as I was driving. It was just me, but it made me laugh because what got us started in it is I go back to my earliest memories of being in Boy Scouts on the campouts, and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches were about all I would eat for like 2 days if you didn't get up early enough and get out there and make the food, because everything was either cooked in bacon fat or or that was it. You just didn't have a chance. So it was the early stage of wanting something to eat other than peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. That's where it all began.
It's so funny that you mentioned Boy Scouts too, because the reason why I started cooking, and I love to cook, is, I was 15 years old, getting tired of the same old mac and cheese. I'm like, no, we got to make some chapli kebab burgers. I'm going down to Rahma Meat Market. We're going to bring some meat. Okay, this is going to be how it's done. And everyone's lives were changed. So
It's a big difference, right? When you start learning to cook, you get experimental. You like to try different things, and it kind of sparks the interest into other areas.
exactly. That's why we're the artistic foodies. It's like food first. You know what I'm saying? So
That's right. That's right.
alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. What about you, Sheikh Tariq? What about your background? Why did you get into what you're doing? And what are your motivations every day?
بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. It initially started out. I mean, I've known Jalal for a long time, so especially once he got more involved with ISA, and I was studying in Medina at the time, we would have lengthy discussions about what goes on in the halal industry, the importance, what goes on behind the scenes. And it always sparked my interest because halal consumption is such a central part of a Muslim's diet, of a Muslim's religion. And we have serious ahadith that relate to the consumption of halal. Like, for example, the Prophet ﷺ said that any body that's nurtured with haram, then annaru awla bih, then hellfire is more suitable for it. That's a serious threat. And that's actually one of the hadith that many of the scholars started the chapter of slaughter with, that hadith, to show the importance of it. And when I began to learn more, I also thought, well, this would be an interesting topic. I was doing my master's at the time, and I actually submitted a proposal to do it on the meat industry in America. And when you submit a proposal, you first have to write out all the issues that you'll cover. Even though it's just a proposal, it might get rejected. But that then entails that you have to do enough research to know what are the important topics that you'll cover. So I did a lot of research into it for about a month and a half or so. In the end, the project it got shelved, but it sparked my interest even more in diving into this. And when Jalal had approached me, actually for some time, to come on board and at least act as a Sharia advisor, consultant, I thought, well, this is something in my field. I don't like to be dependent upon a Muslim community for financial sustenance, and especially for teaching. I don't like to ask money for teaching. I don't take money for teaching. So I thought, at least with research, it's a for-profit company. This should be fun, and quite frankly, Jalal was somebody that I always admired his character, his vision, and so I said, "Bismillah, let's do it. Let's try to change the world." So, motivation-wise, the ultimate motivation was, if there's an opportunity to play a role to serve the ummah, and especially in what I would consider a major issue, which is what they consume day in and day out, and I can, inshallah, be an influence to make sure that that's in line or at least improved, then that was my major motivation. And I'll just add one more point as well, and that is, the fact that the Prophet ﷺ made dua conditional on your consumption being halal. In the famous hadith where he mentioned the person that's traveling and he's disheveled and he's in a desperate state, which is when your dua is most likely answered, especially when you're traveling. And the Prophet said, his drink is haram, his food is haram. فَأَنَّا يُسْتَجَابُ لِذَلِكَ. His maksab, his intake, his clothes is haram, his way of earning is haram. So if we're dealing with us Muslims, particularly in the West, where we've been blessed with so many things, but we see so many other Muslims suffering, and we can help financially, yes, and that's a major, major contribution. But when we feel, especially what we see what's going on in the headlines now, and we feel so shackled and we feel so helpless, when we have one of the best weapons that Allah has given us, which is dua, but that dua is being restricted because of the Big Mac burger that we're having or whatever it may be, then that's a problem. So if there's something that we can contribute to influence that dua being answered, then alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah, I love that. And both your answers are very community oriented, whether saving us from unanswered du'as or saving us from peanut butter and jelly sandwiches.
There's a lot of good in the industry, and especially those that have been in the food industry, or you're a chef, or you've been in a restaurant. I mean, look, alhamdulillah, there's a lot of fun that happens when you go to places like that, and you learn and you teach and enjoy the surroundings of others. And we get enough of the hardships of being in an industry where you got to enjoy sometimes too, right? Whatever industry you're in. So we try to make it fun. But when you get back to the serious side of things, there's some heavy topics that come in, and everybody's got an opinion, and everybody has an idea of what things should be. And it's just when you get down to what's on the ground and what's happening on a day-to-day basis, you got to be surrounded with people that are serious. So when you get out, as they say, when you get out on the field, you go out to win, and you do your best. And when you're off the field, you enjoy time with each other and working on projects. And but there's no doubt at ISA we like to have fun sometimes.
I mean, you can't spell slaughter without laughter. Am I right?
Yeah, there you go. That's clever.
So alhamdulillah. So I'm curious. So you talked about the Singapore halal certifying. You talked about Malaysia. We're talking about America, Canada. Obviously, there's dozens, if not hundreds, at this point of certifying agencies, right? And so I'm curious. 200 years ago, how many certifying agencies were there?
What, I'm sorry, you said 200 years ago?
200 years ago. We've been eating meat for a while. Islam, alhamdulillah, we've been blessed with Islam for 1400 years. Was there certification going on 200 years ago? When did it all start?
The certification was what you found in the texts, right? Whatever was the approved method of slaughter, bismillah, that's what it was. But as something structured, as a company, as an overseer, then that probably wasn't. I mean, the government, obviously, whenever you would have Muslim governments, that they, if there were companies under their watch, or for example, if they were providing, or for zakat, when they would collect zakat from the livestock, and then they would have to redistribute it. But generally, it was always a personal venture. But it wasn't until, now let Jalal take this part over, until the latter part of this century that it became something organized in a business.
Yeah, if you get into the real structure, if you want to know what more where the structure came from, it really started in really around the 1970s, and where that mostly came from is you look at the advancement of the countries around the world as their demographics change, as their economies were evolving, in the Middle East in particular, with the introduction of oil and global sales. There was an influx of cash into those economies, and so they started spending. And amongst the different areas of spending, and being in food, being that they're 90% import dependent upon food and their populations were growing quickly, then there was an influx of food products. And as time evolved, and you had whether they were Americans or Europeans or others that were living in those countries, many of the Muslim governments at the time were looking for alternatives to pork products. They didn't want to bring those pork products in. They didn't want their citizens or their populations to get confused if they were serving the Europeans or they're serving the regular citizen base. And so some of those countries then started looking for halal product. And in the early days, which many people don't understand, is that while today, there are very numerous scholars of fiqh with regard to the knowledge behind it, like Tariq, for example, who studied for 17 plus years in Medina and studied extensively on it. If you go back 50 years or so, it was limited, especially here in the United States. So the early days of halal really resulted in basically staying away from alcohol and staying away from pork, and say Bismillah and eat your food. And so as it evolved over time, is that in countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, they were importing as well food products. And when most of those countries had a population base that either was maybe somewhat illiterate in their own languages, imagine then from food products coming from overseas in different countries. One of the key ways that they were able to look at a product and differentiate whether it was acceptable to eat or not is if they saw the halal mark of identification. So you didn't have to read a product and understand all the ingredients. You could simply see if the mark of halal certification was on there. And that was enough in many cases for a product to then get accepted into the marketplace. So you really had a kind of different things that pulled the halal industry forward. And among those were the evolving economies and population bases, which to this day still drives the growth of this halal market far beyond the ability to really meet the supply at this point. But it is taking place.
That's very curious. I didn't realize it was so recent. So we're talking about within our lifetime.
Correct.
Within this current lifetime, we saw the start and the rise and the evolution of halal certification to what it is now. So it's all very, very rapid and very recent.
Yeah, I mean, you think about some of it was even, if you look at it more from an international standpoint, a lot of us like to look at the franchises like McDonald's and KFC and some of these others. When they branched out internationally as some of the first franchises to go abroad, that's when you found out about the need, or they found out about the requirement for halal. And so then that's where the search would begin, is, well, how do we meet it? What does it mean? And again, in those early days, the discussions that we're having today about zabiha and hand slaughter, the machine and qibla facing and stunning, those are recent, more recent, meaning in the last 15, 20 years or so. But in the early days, it was just, how do you even find a halal program and put one in place? So the evolution has been monumental over the last decades.
That's amazing to see. And so I know you said it started sort of really general, like no pork, no alcohol, and now we're seeing a lot of different specialization. There's some certifiers that focus only on hand slaughtered. There's some that'll say we're coming from a Maliki perspective. So you have all of these different Madhahib as well that are being represented. And, I'm sure that presents unique challenges as well to try and create a unified system. We'll get to that in a second. It's a really fascinating topic for me. But, with that in mind, because everything has been moving so fast in the last 50 years, That means everything is going to continue to move fast. What is it going to look like 50 years from now? What are your hopes as someone who's been in the industry, has seen it? Where is halal certification going, do you think?
I'll give a quick answer, and then I'll turn it over to Tariq as well, because I come from having a long history in it, whereas with him still being new, uh, he has a different perspective, or maybe a fresher perspective too, from a little bit younger generation. From my standpoint, I still see it as one of the greatest opportunities for uh, building out a program for not just Muslim consumers, but all consumers, right? I mean, if you look at it from a standpoint of religion, the halal aspects really go back to the early biblical teachings too. It's not just for Muslims only. And so, if you look at it, however, with the requirements that are put in place from our faith that were followed even in earlier teachings, is that we have an opportunity to provide both the halal and the tayyib aspects of eating food to a population base that's still learning and really hungry, no pun intended, but really hungry for that learning, right?
Mm. Can you
Where,
talk a bit about the difference between, you mentioned halal and tayyib?
yep. So I'll let Tariq get into those finer aspects of it, but on a base level, really it's more of where consumers, and this kind of even goes back to the earlier days in the kosher industry. So the kosher industry had about a 50 to 70 year head start in front of the halal market. And what they did very well too is that they tried to show that there is these additional steps in oversight of food production that people could then feel comfortable with, and that has evolved over time to where it was kosher in the early days. In fact, they used to state in some of the different marketing reports that Muslims were anywhere between 15 to 30% of kosher consumers. Today, that's changing. In fact, now we're finding there are kosher consumers that are also eating halal. And so that has also evolved. So as there's more halal availability, those within the Jewish community that find that it's acceptable to them and they still want something that's close to what they would otherwise have, we're finding that there's growth in that market. You can see that across the numerous thousands of halal restaurants across the country and just going at any point in time. Minnesota is a good example of that. So the halal aspect is such that it's more prevalent and that it's growing with every international market, every domestic market. You're finding that the variety of foods is evolving, everything from Korean short ribs to, double cheeseburgers to Texas brisket barbecue. I mean, you name it, it's out there. And so that's the beauty of it. And one of the key things we have to remember, and this is also sometimes teaching our non-Muslim friends, is that halal is not a specific cuisine. It's not just a nihari kebab, right? It's not, and it's not just a kafta kebab, so it spans the cuisine of anyone who comes from, a different background or ethnicity. So that's just a quick take on the halal side. Tariq can go into a little bit more detail on the tayyib aspect.
Yeah, so I guess you asked about the future of halal and tayyib. Which would you like to start first?
Yeah, just in, in the context of certification in the modern globalized world, what is the future of the industry? I mean, you think we're going to start having tayyib stamps on food? What would that look like? Now with all the imports, the exports, the whole world being connected, where are we going? Where are we going with this? And yeah, if you could talk a little bit about the difference between halal and tayyib and the importance of it as well.
Sure. So I think for the future, uh, you're going to see more and more of a trend of the demand for transparency. We see that in other industries related to the food and beverage sector, everything from how the animals are treated, from when they're in the farm all the way to when they're slaughtered and then delivered. I think there's going to be a growing demand for that transparency. You're going to see more technology that's incorporated to show that transparency. Blockchain and some halal certifiers are already implementing this, where you can just scan the QR code and know which date it was slaughtered, where the animal came from, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I do think then the next shift is going to be touching on the point that you had mentioned, the tayyib aspect. Now, of course, in defining what is tayyib, that is, even scholars of the past, they debated on the definition of khabith and tayyib. Something that is tayyib, which means linguistically pure, beneficial, whether that's tangible or intangible, and something that is clean. And then the khabith obviously is the opposite of that, because Allah Azza wa Jalla said in the Quran about the Prophet ﷺ, one of his attributes, وَيُحِلُّ لَهُمُ الطَّيِّبَاتِ وَيُحَرِّمُ عَلَيْهِمُ الْخَبَائِثِ, that He makes halal for them the pure, lawful, and good, beneficial things, and He prohibits for them the khaba'ith. But again, scholars differed on defining that. Some said that anything halal is by default then tayyib, and others said, no, that would be redundant. Tayyib actually is a level above that. So halal is one, and then tayyib is something above that to where it benefits the person's mind, their intellect, their religion. All of these things.
I want to
Yeah.
interject one thing because this is a good point you're
Sure.
making, and I want to go put a hold on the Sharia part for a second. Let's jump back to the business case, because what he just brought up and what's important is that we need to be careful when we talk about halal and tayyib, or even just halal alone, that while we talk about the additional oversight of halal being of value to whether you're Muslim or not, let's also be careful not to oversell it in a certain way. A Twinkie is still a Twinkie. I don't care how halal you make it, right? But it's not going to fall into the tayyib side of it. Sorry, guys, whoever makes it.
Yeah, and that's and what Jalal mentioned. That's a popular culture amongst halal certifiers now, is that they'll make that distinction even with animals. So they say that, okay, maybe if you slaughter an animal, but the animal itself has been, eating things GMO products and things that are not beneficial for you. It's not grass fed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and it's put in environments that are not an ideal environment for an animal, but you still slaughter and follow all the rules of halal slaughter, then that animal's halal, but it might not necessarily be tayyib. So you have some farmers or smaller halal facilities where they're saying, no, we're grass fed, no hormones. We're making sure that when we slaughter the meat, that it's slaughtered in the highest standard possible, and they'll call that halal and tayyib. There's actually, I know a brother out in Tennessee, mashallah, who has a wonderful business, small, but that's the name of his company, is because he's emphasizing that tayyib aspect. From a religious standpoint, as I said, there's this debate back and forth, but it's not far off from this, according to some of the interpretation of many scholars, that the tayyib is a level above. A tayyib is a level above where it's something that is beneficial to utilize and consume. And that doesn't mean whenever, again, this is an important point distinction to make. When Allah Azza wa Jalla says kulu, when Allah Azza wa Jalla says eat, it doesn't necessarily just mean eat. Kul in Arabic, akala, it also means to consume, utilize. Yeah, so, for example, when Allah Azza wa Jalla prohibits the people who take care of orphans, la ta'kulu amwalahum. Don't. He's not saying literally eat their wealth, the wealth of the orphans, and squander it. No, it's don't consume it without due right. So that, I think we're going to see more of a shift towards, okay, we've covered the halal aspect. Now, is it the tayyib aspect? I think it's quite possible that you'll find some certifiers that they'll start stamping, to your point, something that says tayyib on it. And I do think that many of the things that were traditionally certified as halal may not qualify as halal anymore, especially when, and I'm sorry, there's another element to the tayyib aspect, that it cannot be harmful, or like khabith, because tayyib is the opposite of khabith, something filthy and wicked and malicious. It cannot be harmful to the human body. And so the more studies that come out that show certain ingredients, certain dyes, certain additives are have carcinogenic or are cancerous or have health that can lead to the vast majority of people who consume them in normal amounts might have serious health issues. The more research that comes out regarding those products, you're going to find they will no longer qualify for being halal or tayyib, because sometimes they do overlap and go hand in hand.
Yeah, we're gonna lose a lot of our Twinkie fans.
Yeah, I do think that's going to be the next phase of the halal industry over the next 15, 20, 50 years.
Yeah, and we're already seeing a lot of stuff like, oh, this is organic, this is labeled organic, this is labeled pesticide free, non-GMO. There's a lot of, like you said, transparency is big right now. It's only going to get bigger.
Well, and just to add to that too, that we've in the food industry, consumers, they've had a veil over their eyes for so many years, and have just taken things for granted that, oh, if it's FDA approved, then it's legitimate and it's good to go. It wasn't until the organic movement, that people started to become more health conscious, more aware of what it is that they're putting into their body, and that trend is just going to continue on for the halal consumption as well, and the halal consumer.
I know this presents an interesting challenge too. So, for example, looking into organic, for example, a lot of people might say, oh, organic means that there's no pesticides. Well, actually, it means that organic pesticides were used. Or some people will say, oh, this is USDA organic, but that only means it's 51% minimum organic, not 100%. So, or for example, with eggs, you're looking at pasture raised, cage free eggs. It's like they might not be in a cage, but they still don't have a lot of space. So it's sort of like there's a label and there's the reality, right? Every certifying,
and that's also why we have to be cautious too when separating halal and tayyib as well, because it has to be proven, right? As long that the egg example, if those eggs that are they're not from cage free birds, but they're still not detrimental to your health. They still don't. They just might not be that higher level. There's a difference between the quality of that product and you calling that tayyib and it not being harmful to you or having any type of haram implications. That's dangerous, because then you're essentially telling someone that if they're consuming a product that is perfectly halal, that it has no proven harm to it, that it's not tayyib. No, that's not acceptable. But there is room for a distinction, but it has to be proven and known, or at least overwhelmingly assumed.
There's one other place to go with that too, which lends us to a little bit of caution too when it comes to that aspect of tayyib, is making sure that we don't develop a class-based system on an economic level, because as many Muslims that are out there know that, obviously if you can eat more organic foods and so on, it sounds that it should be better, right? But we also have to recognize that there are many people that look at the cost of that and it seems cost prohibitive. So what do they have as an alternative? In fact, we had a conversation just not too long ago with a representative from a government organization about that aspect, saying, their understanding was that it had to be halal and organic in order to be considered truly halal. I said, no, that's not true. But what Tariq is saying is that the product can still be good, but there may be a different level of it being tayyib, but it's still wholesome. It's still a good product to eat. We just need to make sure that we don't inadvertently cause halal consumers to think that this is the only option out there. And if they're not, they're kind of eating a lesser quality grade of food or otherwise.
Yeah, because then it's like what you mentioned with organic and the nuances of organic and non-GMO. It just becomes a marketing tool in the hands of certain certifiers.
Wellness has become gentrified.
I mean, look at it. One of the big things I was just reading about in one of the fitness magazines that I get coming to the house is I love it because everyone loves talking about intermittent fasting. They love intermittent fasting. And then when you bring up the Son of the Prophet about the Mondays and Thursdays and 3 days of the month and so on, they're just shocked that, what do you mean you guys do fasting, or you have this in your faith? And they said, look, if you want to reduce environmental impact, if you want to reduce sickness and disease and stuff, I mean, fasting is one of those things that was prescribed, and that's part of the food industry, right? Too. We want to reduce waste and other things. So, that's one of the blessings of our faith, is that we take the middle path. And then on that middle path, it's not just the consumption, but it's also the restricting of that consumption as well.
Yeah. That's part of the fitness, like whole body, mind, and soul, like a holistic sort of approach. Because that's part of fitness. And, I'll admit most of these days, the only fitness I'm thinking about is fitness next slice of brisket in my mouth. But, and now let's take a quick break from that and listen in to a word from our sponsors. With locations in Mountain View, Fremont, and San Francisco, Chicken G's has quickly become one of the hottest halal fried chicken spots in the Bay Area. All their chicken is Zabiha halal, and its quality is evident in the impeccable taste. Whether it is their hand-battered chicken sandwiches, the family-style drumsticks and tenders, or their sides of coleslaw and creamy mac and cheese, oh my, it always hits the spot. Stop by Chicken G's today and check it out for yourself. And now, back to the episode. This is a challenge that the average consumer probably doesn't think about so much, but it must be something that is very challenging. I can't even imagine how to overcome the difference between USDA organic and actual organic, the difference between halal certified and something that actually matches to your personal beliefs. Because, for example, folks that only eat halal hand slaughtered, something can be halal certified and they still can't eat it. Someone who is completely allergic to gluten, something might say gluten-free, but there's actually like 0.01% that might cause a reaction. So there's like this, almost like this dissonance between what is certified and what is, because ultimately, and I'd love to actually bridge us into the idea of Madhahib, right? The madhab that one follows for their rulings is ultimately, as many people as there are who practice the faith of Islam, that's how many Muslims, and each Muslim has a unique relationship with God, has a unique relationship with their faith. And a lot of them then get categorized into, I follow this madhab. And then even within this madhab, I follow this scholar, I follow this scholar. So when you have such a huge ummah and so many differences in opinion, how does that work out? And can you give also a little bit of, I'll cut part of my speech out, but can you give a little bit of intro into the topic as well about the madhahib, maybe some differences that are top of mind when it comes to meat, for example, and how you deal with the differences in the context of standardized certification?
Tariq, I'm going to let you jump this one because this is exactly why Tariq came on board and why I've come on board, is to help address this topic. Because as he said, we've moved way past the 30, 40 years ago of what halal was to what it is today. And you've got to have a comprehensive, not just business and industry perspective, but the Sharia aspect has to be completely sound, and the transparency part of it.
Yeah, sure. So when you talk about standardizing and then basing your halal standards on different madhahib, so there's two major categories that we have. You have the protein side, the actual meat slaughter, and then you have the non-protein side, all other products. Now, when you talk about the meat side, yes, the most important factors to look at are the slaughtering methods. And then from the non-protein side, the most important topics that come up from a fiqh perspective is the concept of istihala, transformation, chemical transformation, and then istihlak. Istihlak is absorptions, or when something's dissolved. When you have two products or more, one of them is a haram product, but it becomes overwhelmed by a halal product. So on the meat side, you'll find that most halal certifiers, they are going to either follow one international standard, which many times is based upon a particular madhab or predominantly one madhab, or they're following their own specific madhab. And that's perfectly okay. That's what they're following. The international standards, they tend to be a bit stricter because they try to take the safest route. That way they're the most inclusive of everyone and acceptable by all. But that doesn't respect the nuances of our tradition in fiqh and these differences of opinions, not to mention that some countries that might not be suitable for them, or they follow a different madhab, or the means to achieve that higher standard is not practical or economical. And one of the initiatives that Aossey had already had before I came on board was to have different standards, like a tier system standard of acceptable halal slaughter. One of my major projects has been then to revamp those standards in the lens, though, or under the lens of the different madhahib. And so we have 5 different standards for poultry slaughter. We have 5 different acceptable standards for beef slaughter. Each one of those standards, there's representation of the different madhahib in them. We still try to stick to mainstream or the majority opinion, but we try to be respectful of those different opinions. And so you'll find that, and then to make them uniform, that was the most difficult thing. So that you're not just cherry picking. That was by far the most difficult thing, because you might have in Halal HS1, not an issue, it's pretty much acceptable by all. But once you start getting into the later standards, take, for example, HS3, which would be our kosher standard, our acceptable kosher standard. We'll have conditions that perhaps are more lenient in the Shafi'i madhab with which veins need to be cut. However, in the Shafi'i madhab, they're very strict on what defines people of the book. That's not practical for our times or living in America, for example. And so that way, so we don't just then mix and match. We had to then conform to whatever the predominant madhab of that particular standard follows to make it uniform for the most part. But the goal was, again, to show these different madhabs and the representation in these different standards, and to make it more open and inclusive to the Muslim Ummah as a whole. On that note as well, we stayed away from any outliers, people scholars that were like Ibn al-Arabi from the Maliki Madhab, who pretty much said any way that a person of people of the book kill an animal is acceptable. That's pretty much been rejected by the majority of Islamic scholars, past and present. So we avoided those things because of the great responsibility on our shoulders. And in addition, we also tried to not just confine ourselves to the relied upon opinions within each madhab, but also look at modern day scholars and fiqh councils that have tackled some of these issues, such as stunning, that wasn't present in its form as it is now in the past. And then, of course, we tried to add in and consider, when we develop these standards, a lot of scientific research, veterinary research, animal welfare, and then topped it off with the practicality. Something might look great on paper from a fiqh standpoint, from a scientific standpoint, but on the ground, it's not practical. Or most companies or facilities would not be able to implement it or understand it. And so we had to consider then the practicality and the technical aspects of how these facilities are run. So yes, we have tried to do that with the different madahib and represent them and have a multiple acceptable standards.
It's a pretty unique challenge, and I mean, also, like, as your average consumer, if I see something that says halal on it, if there's even like a moon and a crescent, you know what I'm saying? I think Korea has HAACP. I'm looking at these things and I'm going, yalla, let's go. And there's something that you mentioned that I really wanna shine a spotlight on, is the level of trust, right, that the consumer is putting into these certified, the level of trust that I'm putting my akhirah into the hands of a stamp, essentially. So you mentioned the immense responsibility of getting this right. And I don't think that the average halal consumer understands just how much goes into it or appreciates this. I just want to take a moment to appreciate how much work and how much research and really what goes on into this, because it's really not simple. It's not cut and dry. It's not black and white. So really appreciate you guys for doing this work, man.
Well, Jazakallah khair, and I'll just add to that. There's a couple of points, because that's a question that always comes up: is how much responsibility is on the consumer? And I will say, going back to your original question, what got me involved, this is one of the reasons why I work with Jalel, why I decided to work for a certifying, for Jalel in particular, his certifying company, because I always found Jalel to take these issues more serious. I'm not saying that other certifiers don't necessarily, but from what I've seen and what I saw, the importance that Jalel had stressed on actually having a Sharia team that's actively involved in the business was very motivating for me. So, but then the question is, okay, but what about the average Muslim consumer, right? Is it enough for them to just trust what they see? And the answer is yes and no. It is not supposed to be overburdening on the Muslim consumer that they have to go and do all this research and find out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. No, because again, there is that level of trust. If a Muslim tells them that, this is halal certified. The problem comes in is when you have people like us or others that also try to bridge the gap and show transparency and educate the Muslim consumer. That then puts another burden on us, which is that we have to speak the truth and we have to let people know what goes on and how meat is slaughtered in this country. So then once a person becomes aware of those things, and I know a lot of your listeners are probably going to just stop at this point and say, okay, I've heard enough. I don't want to hear anything more. But once a person now starts to learn more about what actually goes on, now the onus of responsibility becomes greater for them. Because now they might have to do a little more research. Or you mean to tell me that this is how much of the beef is in this country, for example? Okay, now I actually have to see how was the beef slaughtered. Or if they follow a particular madhab, like take for example that they allow for only hand slaughtered poultry. Well, here then, that's their particular madhab that they've put upon themselves to follow, and respectfully, then yes, they should then ask if they know that the majority of poultry in this country is not hand slaughtered. Then they should ask, reach out to the company and ask, or the certifier, and say, is this hand slaughtered or not? But that's also for us why we want to publicize these standards and promote them, is so we can say, okay, if you want and label properly. If you want, for example, hand slaughter, that's HS1. HS2 is going to be mechanical slaughter, and here are the scholars and fiqh bodies that allow for it.
Abbas, one thing I'll add to what Tariq's saying, and it is something. I didn't get these gray hairs for nothing. I earned these. I earned those. but what I want to say is that the education, it goes back to education. And for any of us that grew up in an Islamic center, and whether it's the Midwest or West Coast or anywhere else around the country, if you think about it, halal, understanding halal and what it means to us was really relegated to probably, Eid al-Adha, right? You go out and you slaughter an animal. Maybe some still do. A lot of people don't, but for those that do, you went out and slaughtered an animal. That's just one small part of it, right? But when it comes down to, like you said, if you look for the stamp, you're like, yalla, let's go. I mean, that's really what's happened. And part of that is because if you look across the country, and let's just focus on the United States, you look across the United States right now, there's maybe 5 or 6 certifying bodies that are doing as best they can in many ways to try to represent the diversity of what is developing. And then on top of that, to interact with industry, which is multi-billion dollar lobbying groups, CEOs and organizations that are turning out food products on a daily basis. And then the other side, you've got government. And being in the United States, we don't have an Islamic, department within the United States Department of Agriculture. So you're trying to coordinate together. And many of the certifying groups are working at it. And then you're trying to work amongst international standards. So there is a tremendous amount of challenge involved. But the beautiful part of this is that also, as our Muslim population is growing in the United States, there are people among, even like yourselves, like look at the podcast you're putting out. We didn't have such things like that. Our brother Shahid from Zabiha.com years ago, they had Zabiha.com that came out. That was a turning point, right? There are halal food companies that are out there. I mean, so the opportunities that are before us today, there are many young Muslims out there that see doing something other than being a doctor or an engineer as exciting, right? That you can be in the food industry, you can be a nutritionist, you can be in marketing and media, and that's what we need to start moving forward. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, from Tariq's standpoint, I appreciate what you said about me, by the way, and from likewise, I knew him to be someone that comes from a standpoint of first of all, being fun to hang out with, right? We do.
Yeah, I saw the burger. It looks like a good time.
I always tell the team, I came from a sports background. All right, so I got we have the shirts, we have the jerseys, that kind of thing, and it's about performing. It's about performing and doing things well and enjoying it. But when it comes back to the work side of it, it's like I want somebody who's going to take it serious and that we can rely on, and that also, and I don't mean this in a wrong way, but also grew up here in the States, because we have so many things that like our previous generations that came from overseas, they don't have those same upbringings, so they don't understand fully the challenges. Even to this day, I know Tariq and I both speak at different times with families that are maybe first generation, and they're saying, here they have no clue what's going on with their children at home or at school or with their friends. And so we can lend some of that, at least to the food space, and then encourage them to say, look, there are greater opportunities in the markets that are out there today to do something more than just being an engineer and a doctor. And we need that as an ummah. And the blessing of that is what you're going to see over the next 10, 15, 20 years, because this market is growing so quickly that there's enough room for everybody in here. And so we want to see people that are going to come on board and take the knowledge that they've earned over the last many years and help apply that to our industry so then we can move it forward. And that's really what we're working for.
It's really amazing, and especially overcoming the challenges of so much plurality. I imagined a scenario, for example, where there's 4 or 5 people sitting at a table, and depending on what madhab or what their understanding is, each of these Muslims, for some of them, one thing is halal, the other thing is not. For one of them, eating the octopus is halal, the other one is not. For one of them, the hand slaughtered chicken is okay, the machine slaughtered is not. So there is the diversity within opinions, is diversity within how we practice our faith. There's a little bit of a plurality within that, and yet we still have one ummah. We still have a dedication to eating halal. We still have people who care about what goes into my body because it affects my relationship with God. That's a unifying factor. So it's really interesting to see how these challenges are being overcome with different levels of standardization, with working with, different, and even we're seeing specialization now with certifying agencies to where there are some agencies that will only certify hand slaughtered. So if you want to be able to say, look at a stamp and be like, okay, I trust it, you're going to look for that stamp. And so within the plurality of the practice of our faith, we're seeing also within the industry, there's a little bit more differentiation and specializations and levels of, like you're saying, we're talking about levels of halal. Now let's get to tayyib, and there's going to be levels of tayyib. You know what I mean? And it's.
I mean, think about it, even from the standpoint, like I mentioned about interaction with the food industry and with government. I mean, we need Muslims that are educated in politics and negotiation and lobbying and regulatory aspects. There are even today there are many that are out there in certain cases, but I mean, think about it on an aspect of global trade. The United States is kind of the breadbasket to the world, so to speak. And in many areas of that, food products that are exported abroad are going to many markets that require halal certification. So there's a tremendous demand on having people that are in these fields or have interest in these fields to reach out to certification bodies, to reach out to food companies that are trying to export to these markets or even supply the domestic market. One of the fastest growing areas right now that we're working on is in the college and university campuses across the country. And some of them are even in corporate dining facilities where we've established a relationship with an organization that is trying to develop a program on how to approach the cooking, the preparation, the presentation of halal foods on campuses and dining facilities across the country. And they want to learn. They're looking for people to help teach them about that, and then how to then supply and make sure that supply chain is intact so that they can make sure it's available. Look, at the end of the day, businesses pay attention to the consumer because the consumer is the one that opens up, and provides them the money to buy their products. And like anything that's happened over the last decade that has really pushed things forward, it's because consumers are educated and they're asking or demanding or requesting for more information. And that's where this is going to continue to go. So transparency will continue to lead the way.
Yeah. And Abbas, again, that you had mentioned, we have these different halal standards and what people consider. You might have 5 Muslims sitting around and each one might have a different standard. But what's important to remember, again, for the average Muslim is that the Sharia, our religion, has always greatly respected these different opinions as long as they're legitimate differences of opinion. Whenever there's a legitimate difference of opinion, there's almost a difference of opinion on any topic, then when a person's following that with certain conditions, again, they're not just cherry picking, then that's legitimate. That's fine. They're following their madhab. And so much effort and energy is exhausted in Muslims fighting over these specific topics, when in reality, it shows again the importance of education. Because with education then broadens your horizon. With education, specifically on these topics, you can say, Abbas is choosing to eat, for example, mechanical slaughter. I'm choosing to eat only hand slaughtered.
And Jalel is just eating Twinkies. Huh?
And Jalal's scarfing down, a box of Twinkies on his way to work and back. But the point is that we can advise him about his addiction. The point is that the point is that we can respect, as long as they're legitimate differences of opinion. We can have fun, we can debate, we can get into the evidence, but there should still be a base level of respect, of understanding that this is legitimate and that's legitimate. I'm not saying that everything you see halal certified is necessarily legitimate. That's where, again, the education, distinguishing between acceptable and then what that range is, and then unacceptable. But we do have to be open minded enough to be able to respect one another while having civil conversations.
And along that line, what Tariq mentioned too is it leads us into really what's happening in the food industry today too. There are new areas and avenues of products that are being requested for certification that we are still trying to figure out amongst us as a certifier, amongst our peers in the certification, and even globally as to what can and cannot or should not be certified as halal. Everything from insects to wines that are non-alcoholic to plant-based foods to cultured meats to, we've had products that actually the product in and of itself is considered to be halal, but the packaging or the wording on the product might be confusing or considered. We've had like margarita chicken breast or Jack Daniel's barbecue whiskey beef ribs. Well, the beef ribs themselves are halal, right? But the Jack Daniel's, even if there's no Jack Daniel's realistically in it, but it's associated with alcohol. So supplements have the same thing, certain words or phrases that might be either
or images.
Yeah. So, there are many facets to this too, where we have to make decisions at times to say, look, the product can be halal or certified as halal. However, because of your image that you have in there or the wording, we're choosing not to, at least from our company standpoint, because it could be confusing or misleading to the consumer or send wrong. We had requests for pork-based plant meats.
Hold on, what?
So think about that, right? I shouldn't say pork-based, but it's a pork alternative, but it's a plant-based product meant to taste like pork, but it's purely plant-based, right?
So like a soy bacon, like a
sure,
fakin.
Whatever you want, a pork chop that's really made from plants. So
interesting.
Imitation.
It could be halal, right? But if we put the certification mark in there, some people will look and just simply see the word pork and be like, "Oh my God, these guys are, doing something horrible." So you've got to take into consideration not just what you're certifying, but the full context, where it's going to be exported to, or maybe it's going to end up at a Albertsons out on the West Coast somewhere, and so someone's going to grab that and it might be confused. So there are areas that we're venturing into now that, again, are more complex than they've ever used to be.
That's really interesting. I want to get into some of these examples too. But I really appreciate what you said about respect. Like these 5 people around the table, they can still have this meal, if everyone enjoying what they can enjoy from their own understanding, and walk away as friends, as homies, right? Unfortunately, throughout organizing within like halal food events and stuff like that, I work with a lot of owners, and it's really unfortunate, man. Like this one owner, she called me, she told me, she said someone had called her up and berated her for a half hour on the phone, saying you don't have any hand slaughtered stuff. It's all machine slaughtered. You can't even call yourself a halal restaurant. You're feeding poison to the Muslims here. And she's like, listen, man, first of all, I didn't ask for your opinion, right? I'm doing this the way I've been doing it for the last 10, 15. Her restaurant's shut down now because not a lot of people went out and supported it. And you know what I'm saying? So if that's the thing, is like, if you eat hand slaughtered and you're so passionate about it, eat hand slaughtered, but there's nothing along the ethics or the values that tell you that you need to call up an owner, berate them for a half hour, and make them feel like basically calling them non-Muslim for not agreeing with what your choices are.
Well, in our best, that goes back to the education again,
Exactly.
right? The importance of education, and that was one of the reasons why in our standards, whatever standard that we had issued at the end of the standard, I included a list of scholars and fiqh, international, well-known fiqh bodies that approve of the specific standard. Um, Hand slaughter, just on that topic, the vast majority of fiqh councils approved of it. Vast majority. When we say fiqh council, that means these are teams of scholars from around the world that come together and they debate these issues. Now, it does have problems. There's no question. Hand slaughter is better. Yes. However, it is, according to the vast majority of scholars, with strict conditions, an acceptable standard. And I know before we go into the next topic, I had also mentioned that we have, when it regards to different opinions in Madhahib that we consider on the non-protein side, we can leave that for a different discussion if you'd like, if because I know time is cutting short. But I will just say that there are some times where we might follow a madhab that I'm not going to say we don't agree with it, but on the point of respect for this other madhab, but an international standard follows that protocol. And so the products being exported to that specific country, then we respect it and we respect their scholars that they allow for that. Or it might not even be the strongest opinion that I agree with, or I'm not fully comfortable, but because of what a hardship it would be for the Muslims to not follow that particular opinion. For example, vinegar. In the Hanafi madhab, they're the most laid back that there can be human interference in producing vinegar from the stage of when it goes from juice to wine, then back to vinegar. We've taken that as an internal standard, that as an approach, because to follow a different opinion would almost make most vinegar inaccessible to Muslims, and we have the default and that the Prophet ﷺ praised vinegar and the health benefits of vinegar. So there are times that, we that's one of the benefits that we try to always consider at ISA is to look at these other madahib and to see how they relate to the specific issue and environment.
So yeah, so this is one of the things that you'd brought up earlier, and we're seeing it in the news. And me personally, it's not really something that I think about a lot because, well, it's expensive, and that's the lab grown meat. It's not gotten to a point yet where lab grown or cultured meats have made it to consumer shelves in a way that it competes with other proteins. So it's not really something beyond just a theoretical question in my mind right now, but things move fast. Right. So what are cultured meats from your research? What is this lab grown meat? What is the process? And how do you make it halal?
I think I'll start with an easier vantage point first is why are we producing these types of meats, right? For what reason is it being kind of pushed? Because look at maybe 5 years ago or so, the big push was plant-based meats. Now we've had plant-based meats for a very long time, but when you turned on the television or looked on social media or on the news, it was a huge media push that everyone's got to be into plant-based meats, and we're going to all be eating plant-based meats, into the future. And there is some aspect to that in different ways. It just depends on what comes out of it. Is the aspect of what kind of foods are we going to eat? Why are we going to eat these? And you look at the cultured meats today, and the question was, who's pushing it? Why are they pushing it? And what are the supposed benefits and otherwise? And so you always have to kind of step back first and ask yourself, well, yeah, this is trending, but why is it trending? And why before you even get into the religious side of it, why should I consider eating that? What is it trying to solve? And so once you get to that point, and then from our end, when we start getting the inquiries with regard to, well, can you halal certify it? That's where then we got to look and see, well, again, then how is it produced? What are they pulling from? What are the sources of the raw material inputs, and whether or not those can even be considered halal? And even if they do, then how do we determine where it starts? And so that's the stage where we're really at right now, because it's only been in the last couple years we've really started hearing about cultured meats. We've seen, I think, a few rabbinical organizations in the kosher industry that have approved it. Halal is still something new. I know amongst halal certifiers we've had some discussions, but it's still new. And I'm going to let Tariq go into more of the fiqh aspects of it from a business standpoint. Really, where I'm looking at it from is, what application does it have for the greater consumer, and what reasons would a consumer want to choose this as an option? And again, what are we trying to replace or to prevent from happening? And so with that, I'll turn it over to Tariq, and he can go into more of the Sharia aspects of it.
Yeah, and I'll add to that as well that again, kind of to Jalal's point, Muslims always have to be cautious. People in general, whenever there's we have people in general have this tendency that whenever there's something trending or always being pushed to the forefront or in their face, that they want to jump on board, and it takes over the discourse of many, cafe. One of the best things to do sometimes is just slow down, take a step back. Let's look at again the fundamentals of our religion. What's being asked? What's the end game? What are the intentions, etc., etc. We have the default, which is actual meat, right? And again, I am not. I want to make this clear. I am not saying that cultivated meat or even the veggie based meat is wrong and it goes against the Quran and Sunnah. No, I'm not saying that at all. But what I am saying is remember what the default is and what Allah Azza wa Jal has bestowed upon us. أَوَلَمْ يَرَوْا أَنَّا خَلَقْنَا لَهُم مِّمَّا عَمِلَتْ أَيْدِينَا أَنْعَامًا فَهُمْ لَهَا مَالِكُونَ. Allah Azza wa Jal says, haven't they seen that we have single-handedly created for them these livestock that they own? وَذَلَّلْنَا لَهَا وَذَلْنَاهَا. Like Allah Azza wa Jal then says that, and we subjugated it for them. لَهُمْ فَمِنْهَا يَرْكَبُونَ. They ride on it and they eat from it. There's a lot of benefit in consuming meat that Allah Azza wa Jal has created for us. So then if you look at, okay, well, what's the push against it? Who's pushing it? And why? From a sustainability aspect, from environmental aspect, sure, there's a lot of merit to it. But what about the long-term effects? Have that been studied yet? Consuming cultured meat, in the end of the day, it's still a processed food. Veggie-based or meat alternatives are still processed food. And generally speaking, in nutrition, anything that's in its pure form is healthier and better for you than something that is, like they always say, if it comes from a plant, if it's a plant, eat it. If it comes from a plant, be more cautious. And now here we're talking with cultured meat. It's a lab. You can't even call it a plant. And so we have to be cautious because what are the long-term health aspects of it that we, quite frankly, do not know. And we won't know until you take a group of people who have consumed this every single day or quite frequently, and what are the health effects 10, 20 years. Now, from a purely fiqh standpoint, the way that the meat is produced, it's extracted from stem cells in the blood or tissue of an animal. And the Prophet ﷺ said that مَا قُطِعَ مِنَ الْبَهِيمَةِ وَهُوَ حَيٌّ فَهِيَ مَيِّتَةٌ. The Prophet ﷺ said that whatever has been extracted, separated from a living animal, while it's alive, then it's meta. It's considered najis. It's considered carry-on. So that means the blood. That means the tissue. That means anything that's extracted from that animal. Now, yes, there's debate if it's the hair or something that has life in it or not. But here we're talking about actual meat or stem cells or things that have blood. So from a simplistic fiqh standpoint, it wouldn't be allowed. Does it go through a proper istihada process or whatnot? Allahu Alam, that would require more research. From what I've seen, that the original effect of those cells remain constant, and therefore it wouldn't. So in that regard, then it wouldn't be acceptable. Are there ways to make it acceptable? Yes. From a purely black and white fiqh standpoint, yes. But again, I think the question is we have to look at the long-term implications as well. And then, what's called the greater maslaha. If we're in such a dire state from from an environmental standpoint that this is our only means for a food alternative, then without question, it becomes, there's more room for permissibility, again, as long as it's done accordingly. But all of that investment in cultured meats, have we looked at other alternatives, other sustainable alternatives to still eat meat, but where it's not so detrimental to the environment and where it's not so costly for Muslims? What's the price on a cultured meat patty? The last I checked, it was like $10 or more. It's very expensive. So then on top of it, it's not solving the economic benefit of the individual as well. So it's complex. It's a complex issue that has short-term and long-term implications that we have to consider.
Nice. So the jury's still out, or I should say the shura is still out.
I wouldn't say the jury's out as long as it's extracted from a living animal. Then we have that
Right.
principle that the Prophet ﷺ laid out. If it's extracted from a living animal, from its blood or from its tissue, then that original source is najisa.
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, the further line of what it turns into, does it turn into a complete transformation process? From my limited, very limited understanding, it does not, but it would require more research. But
That's interesting. So it's not permissible to eat of an animal that is still alive. Like let's say I have this big cow, but I'm not ready to eat the whole cow, and I just want to cut off a slice and keep it alive.
yeah,
That's not
I
okay.
want that T-bone or that yeah, exactly. That get a little bit of chuck cut off for you and throw a burger out of it. And this is exactly what the some of the people of Medina were doing when the Prophet ﷺ first. This is where the hadith came from. They were cutting off pieces of the hump of an animal, and then because we still want to ride the animal, we still want it to produce milk, etc., etc., etc. And so they were doing that and cooking that up. And the Prophet ﷺ said that whatever is separated from an animal while it's alive, then it's considered meat. It's also considered carry-on.
It's amazing that we have such a direct example. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that example because it seems like a very direct example. It's like because a lot of what I've seen with
Right.
cultured meat is like we're taking these cells and then we're multiplying them. But the
Right.
original,
But it's still from that original
yeah,
cell.
the
Right.
original guy Dolly's still hanging out on the farm. You know what I mean?
Right.
So that's a very interesting perspective. And I want to okay, so that is something very very new. I want to ask about something that is very very old. You were talking about plant based. Here's a plant that's been cultivated by humans for thousands and thousands of years, used in various different contexts, whether it's medicinal, ceremonial. I've read about its spiritual use, and also has been misused and overused, especially more so recently. Where do we as Muslims stand on cannabis? And also, I'll take it to the next level because my background's in pharmacology and toxicology. There's I think 250 or more bioactive compounds within cannabis. So when we're talking about cannabis, we're not just talking about THC. Another very complex issue, but you're doing amazing at
How
teasing
many did you
things apart.
say? How many did you say?
250,
What was the number you gave?
250 or so, you said.
Yeah, from my reading, it was 500. But only two of them have been properly studied: CBD and THC. So there are still so many elements that haven't been properly studied and examined. And I'll give you, just to show you some of the complications of this product and the unknown. You have, for example, there are certain aspects to THC itself because so cannabis plant it absorbs a lot of metals, right? It has the ability to absorb a lot of metals, and so THC actually has an element that triggers the liver to produce enzymes that filter out those toxins, those metal toxins. Well, when you take the THC away, you still have the cannabis plant, and it then has a potential to absorb those heavy toxins. It's complex, like you said, biochemistry. And again, that's why people have to be, because there's different levels. You have the level where, from a religious standpoint, where they examine something and they'll just take it as black and white and look for a quick answer. Okay, and if you don't necessarily conform to what the modern push is, then you're considered backwards or old fashioned. But then there's a level above that, and that level above that, and this is where it's usually these issues are left to fiqh councils, is where they examine not just a simple ruling for yay or nay. No, what are the greater implications? What are the masalih, the overall benefits to the world and to the Muslims? What are the mafasid? Not just now, but even long term as well. So when it comes to this topic, we also have to be cautious that, again, the health issue, and then what is it being used for? I'll give you some defaults. One default is whenever you're talking about consumption of anything, there is a major distinction between what you ingest and what you apply topically. Whatever you ingest, the rules are going to be stricter. And whatever you apply topically, then generally speaking, even if it's impure, you're allowed to do that as long as it's washed off before your next prayer. So when we look at CBD products, we also have to be able to distinguish between those two categories. But then, like you said, from all of the other compounds that we find in the cannabis plant, we need to examine those. From a very basic level, yes, if there is no THC in it or very limited THC, then there's room for that to be halal and allowed to use again, but for what purpose? Here's another issue that comes up that makes it more complicated. If you have a more natural product like a CBD, okay, now this gets into the greater benefit or harm, and but it has certain question marks around it at the very least. And then you have a pharmaceutical synthetic drug that doesn't have any intoxicating effects. It's what we know a lot about it, but is that could be more detrimental for your health long term. It might have more serious side effects, and CBD might be a better option. The point is that this requires a lot of research. Personally, I'll throw one more curveball out to you from a certifying standpoint, because we had this actually come up within our own organization a couple of times, where you might have a company that has a product, but what's the end use purpose for it? The original product or the initial product might only be used as a medium, or it might be used in another product where the THC level might go up, it might go down. So we have to be cautious of that. But then also, who's utilizing it? What are they promoting? Is it an organization that they're coming with the CBD front, that they're just promoting the health benefits of CBD, when in reality they're pushing for a greater next step, which is to essentially use marijuana and speak of and to promote the spiritual, quote unquote, spiritual benefits, et cetera, and then move on to psychedelics and other drugs. These are all things that weigh very heavy on us that we have to consider. And CBD isn't the only product that's being promoted. There's another one that I can't remember what it was, but it has like 20% more THC than, I can't remember. We had a company that came up that we had never even heard about it until they came to us. We had to read studies about how many people were actually testing positive for THC because they were only using CBD products, but because it's not as regulated and because they were using it on a daily basis, it actually, they weren't smoking, they weren't using marijuana, but it had actually showed small traces of THC to where they lost their job. That was something we also have to
Hey,
go back. So
go back to the point of
it's
why
complicated.
does the industry rise up too? Look at the effects of, yes, there are medicinal purposes, but was it also another way to earn tax dollars? Was it also a way to, I mean, what is the tax rate on those products that are in the marketplace now? Have you looked at that or studied that to see what is the amount of money that is able to be earned by the government with respect to taxes?
That's why you should support your local dealers, guys. No taxes.
Yeah, but you know what I mean. It's not always just what we're told. You got to look and see, well, what's another way of bringing in additional revenue and other areas of the economy that are affected. So there are multiple facets, and that's why it's alhamdulillah, it's a blessing having on a team someone from a Sharia background and others from food science and others from business and from marketing. I mean, I go back to that earlier point in the podcast about it. You need to have a community of youth that are developing and growing into different fields. So you bring those perspectives together and you can try to address it. Because again, at the end, if we're going to give a seal or a stamp or something, we've got to understand as best we can, right? And that we've done as good a job as we can in bringing in people of different expertise and backgrounds to help be part of that decision-making process.
Yeah,
and that's what's
yeah.
evolving. And it's, as you just mentioned in these last few minutes, there are areas within the industry that there are companies that have dedicated teams, right? I mean, 10s or 20, 30 people or more of research and such. And we're trying to do this as an industry with a limited base and growing demand for areas that are maybe outside the original expertise of what the Islamic food industry had been
Right.
dealing with for decades.
And that goes back to a point, our best too, that we had mentioned before. There's We always make the distinction, and the consumer has to understand this as well as the client, that there's a distinction between what might be permissible for the average Muslim to
Yeah.
consume and what ISA as a certifier will approve.
Right.
Because again, there are more implications that and responsibility that's upon us, and we will tell our clients that as well, so that they, from out of say out of veneration for the Sharia, we're not necessarily. We'll make that clear to them. We're not saying that your product is necessarily haram. We're just saying that we can't
Because
certify
you
it.
certify for everyone across the board, all consumers, no special cases, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Because I think when it comes to cannabis, a lot of times you can get into these special cases, and when I was doing my research, I found disagreement on what intoxication means and how that's been defined over the course of Islamic history, and that being the number one reason why people, well, that not people, but the scholars will say that THC is not allowed is because it's an intoxicant, right?
Now, intoxications there. So there's no there's more of a uniformity with amongst the scholars of intoxication. Where they'll debate is on the impurity aspect, but generally there's a standard. Intoxication has different phases or
Yeah,
stages. Anything that alters your mind or judgment,
yeah,
to the point where, so what would be like the initial buzz stage, if you will, for alcohol or alcoholic beverage, that's considered intoxication. And then you look at the average person. So if somebody is much smaller in size and they become intoxicated by a lesser amount, as opposed to, you look at the average. But generally, the intoxication isn't necessarily an issue. What level of intoxication? It's more, how much of that amount of something causes intoxication. That's where there's more debate. Like you have in nutmeg, there's a classical debate. Um, Even in saffron.
So there's
But
a
yeah,
lot of like plant-based, traditionally used things that have been used for thousands of years, including kava, for example, is used a lot in the Pacific Islands. That's one thing that actually a doctor suggested that I try out. Kava, kratom, cannabis. Obviously, these are in the conversation, but there's a lot of different things. And you mentioned psychedelics as well. We talk about mushrooms and ayahuasca and a lot of these things. I mean, I just appreciate the fact that we're having this conversation, because a lot of these things have been in a black box. You don't look at it, you don't research it, you don't even think and talk about it. And
well, I predicted that about 7 years ago or so. I predicted that psychedelics are going to be pushed and strongly marketed, and states will start legalizing
right.
it. And the only reason, actually, that's a whole nother
Yeah, yeah,
conversation
yeah,
that I
yeah.
know we don't have enough time for. But the question is why? I'm not trying to praise myself at all, but you said research. Why did I predict that? Because I saw where the trend was going. Because Allah Azza wa Jal tells us to not follow the footsteps of shaitan. Not follow the footsteps of shaitan. That means you need to know shaitan's plan.
Yeah.
You need to know the ways that he pushes certain things. And when you learn that, certain things become quite evident. So the push for psychedelics and everything. But I'll just pose this as food for thought. When people look at psychedelics and these other things, I know we're beyond the halal consumption part, but as a medicinal purpose for mental health, because that's usually what it is.
Right.
Person's not taking psychedelics because they have a ACL injury, right? It's because of some type of mental issue. The question that a person has to ask themselves is, what are the other alternatives? What are the other spiritual alternatives? Let me be clear 100%. I don't think you'll find any scholar, past or present, that would ever allow for psychedelics. Let's just be clear. But for a Muslim to consider, what are the other alternatives? How much? It's just like health, your physical body. If a person is consuming junk food all day and night, they never work out, they never go to the gym, what's their physical state going to be? Bad. And if they want to get in shape, many we're living in fast food society. People just want a quick fix, and that's not how life generally works. Just give me a weight loss pill. It's not how it works. So then the question is, when a person is looking for that spiritual remedy, have they taken the proper followed the proper protocol that's laid out in our religion? So have they cut themselves off from harmful things that bring their spirit down, from what they consume halal and not halal, from the sins that they're involved in, from the bad habits that they're involved in, from being around toxic people, or always being on the screen, and just consuming spiritually things that are detrimental to their spiritual health. And then have they offset that with the things that uplift their spirit?
Yeah.
ألا بذكر الله تطمئن القلوب.
Right.
So not with the remembrance of Allah Azza wa Jal that the hearts find tranquility. Oh, brother, you just telling me that I just need to remember Allah and I'll be happy? Well, are you remembering Allah the way that Allah told you to remember Him? In fact, لمن كان له قلب, who has like a present heart, not that they're on their phone every 5 seconds, no, but they're actually reflecting in the Quran, reading the Quran, cutting off these harmful things from their life. Like you said before in the beginning of the conversation, a holistic approach. That's what our religion is has a central theme in. So Muslims have to consider these things before they start talking
Yeah.
about quick fixes all the time.
This is
And again,
fascinating
who
topic.
are you? Who's influencing you? Who's pushing this whole agenda? Who is it? Are these people that are truly spiritually grounded with Allah and have knowledge in Allah's religion?
Yeah, and it's interesting because like especially right now, like you said, you'd be hard pressed to find a scholar that supports it. A big issue right now is if a scholar did try and support it, they'd be out of a job. I've talked to a few scholars that
But are they scholars? I would question that, and I would say
that's why
regardless,
they'd be out of a
or
job,
not.
right? Because people would be like, well,
Yeah, no, I'm saying when we even give them the platform to say that they're a scholar,
Yeah.
right? So that the term scholar, and this is why I get so upset when people try to, the term scholar, right? That has a very high level implication,
yeah,
and because in the West we are so let's just be frank, there's so much of our Islamic sciences we're ignorant to. I know this because I was born and raised here. Fundamentals of our religion we're unaware of, and alhamdulillah it's getting much better. But that also then means who we define as a scholar many times is not necessarily a scholar. They might be someone who studied, they might be someone who speaks well, they might be someone that is very motivational and influential, and that's wonderful. But they might not, they're many times they're not necessarily on that scholarly level where they can tackle these issues. So if we say that a scholar would say this, we have to truly question, are they, number one, do they meet that qualification in the first place?
yeah, yeah. And I mean that's why we have councils and why we have discussions and why we have
Right.
general consensus. A couple of examples come to mind. The Graduate Theological Union, which is a seminary in I believe it's in Berkeley, California. So they have this end of life chaplaincy program. And one of the things that they're starting to do actually is to train the chaplains on how certain psychedelics can be used to combat end of life anxiety and allow this person to be more present. And amongst these are Muslim professors, people who have studied and have looked at the thousands of years of research that are behind that. Another example that comes to mind, we talked about mental health. Man, we're living in some really difficult times. I know so many more people that are suffering now than historically we didn't have as many issues. Just society, the culture, the world that we live in. There's a lot of madness. And so the example that came to mind is, for example, you may have someone that has such an intense mental health issue that for them it's almost like they're not sober unless or until they're medicated and they can think clearly, for example. So I understand completely on a certification level, you guys are certifying for every Muslim overall, and you can't take special care. You can't say, oh, this is okay for this person, this is okay for that person. So from a certification perspective, I totally understand. Because then if you say that, weed is okay, you're saying it's okay for everyone. And for everyone that it's not okay for, then that's your responsibility. So I understand that 100%. I'm curious to know, because there are some differences between Madhahib when it comes to this specific topic, are there any situations where it is permissible to have a little bit of THC in it?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, the main rule, and again, there's a difference between, like you said, certifying and then fatwa.
Yeah, exactly. So what's the fatwa, I guess, is my question.
The fatwa, again, that's based upon the circumstances. I don't think you'll ever find any scholar that will say that weed or marijuana is permissible unless it's like a life or death situation, right? Let's say you have somebody, they're going through extreme withdrawal, or you have somebody that says, if I don't do this, I'm going to kill myself, or
Yeah.
something. But
Yeah.
again, لا حكم للنادر. There's not a ruling for the outliers. But there may be a special fatwa for, because of khaf al-dararain, the lesser of the two evils, for something very specific at a very specific time. But any time that, especially when it's a non-alcoholic beverage like marijuana, it has to be on a limit that is not intoxicating. The percentage has to be to where it does not alter the mind at all. So even if it has minimum levels of THC, it's not the THC in and of itself that is haram when it comes to, again, non-alcoholic beverages, as opposite to alcoholic beverages and alcohol content. No, it has to be an amount that is non-intoxicating. I gave the example of nutmeg. Nutmeg can be a hallucinogen if you take large amounts of it. But does nutmeg necessarily haram? No. If you use it as just a spice, if you use it to a certain level to where it's not intoxicating, then it's not haram. Very similar to cannabis.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Now, again, it's not an open door.
Yeah, no, exactly. For anyone that's listening, you're not going to get your green pass here. If you're listening to get you, oh yeah, scholar said I can do it. You're not going to find that here. Remember, it's research. Like you said, it's education, it's circumstance. If you do feel like there's a medical need for your use, talk to doctors that know what they're talking about. Not the doctors that are on the corporation's pay bill and just pushing whatever pills are trending, but like talk to healers. Are there other ways? Are there better ways to help yourself?
From a Sharia perspective, another condition is there has to not be any other alternative.
Right, exactly.
If there's an alternative, like any time if you take something that's haram and say that it's allowed for medicinal purposes, there are certain conditions that have to be met. One of those conditions is they have to be Muslim experts and doctors that advise so. Why Muslim? Because a non-Muslim isn't going to respect the religion of the Muslim. They're not going to respect the Sharia. So it has to be a Muslim doctor, unless there's no Muslim doctor present, which alhamdulillah, we're not short of, especially here in America. Number two, there can't be any alternative.
Right.
Number three, the doctor has to be very confident that it will solve the problem, that it will actually be a remedy and not cause more harm. But again, these are all things that are the standards, these guidelines, they're explicitly laid out in our Sharia, but because we're living in the times that we're living in, unfortunately, people who know them, and people who don't.
And alhamdulillah, the Sharia itself has been given to us as a mercy. Allah knows our hearts, our minds, our bodies more. He created us, right?
And that's an excellent point. Exactly. Allah never ordains something or commands us to do something except that it's for our own benefit. Allah is ghaniyun anna. He doesn't need us. And He never prohibits something except that it's for our own benefit as a mercy.
Alhamdulillah. So grateful, very grateful to you all for your time in this discussion. We covered a lot of really interesting topics. I mean, this has been one of the more fascinating conversations for sure. It's like popping the hood and seeing the engines and the machinations of the certifying industry. I mean, I learned so much from both of you here. I'm
awesome.
Really, really grateful.
Yeah,
we'll bring you on a trip one time, and we'll do one of those dines across the country type scenarios where we take you on a trip and give you real life inside.
We got to do it, man. Just let me know if you need any taste testers for any products you guys are certifying. I'm a big fan of beef jerky, man.
Well, hopefully we'll get you back whenever we have a project that we're working on with a company here in the States, actually on the likes of that for bison jerky. So hopefully you'll get them up and going, and we'll give you a chance.
See, I'm a little more excited than the lab grown meat. I really want to know what bison tastes like, man.
Oh yeah, I think really at the end, Abbas, it's more or less a couple of things I leave the listeners with is continue to look at ways that you can impact the Ummah in a positive way, right? As far as what the careers that you can go into that are in the fields of food, if that's what they're interested. There's numerous ones, and it could be anything from medical and research to processing and develop and marketing and otherwise. Education is the big one that is really the next transition. So from the career side of the other areas is the transparency for consumers to continue to ask questions about how their products are produced. What's the value in those, and then start thinking about the halal and the tayyib aspect, because that is going to continue to come up and be discussions that maybe the previous 20, 30 years we didn't really get into, but now as the markets continue to evolve, those are areas that are becoming more familiar. So again, it's great to have people ask questions. And the last thing I'll leave with is be nice, be kind, treat everybody with a little bit of respect and dignity whenever you have conversations, and recognize that there are differences of opinions that are meaningful and can be substantiated. And when you go through that process, I think you'll learn quite a bit.
Yeah, and I'll just a few closing points. Number one, the remembrance of the importance of what we put into our body. That is a central theme in our religion, and there is this foundation in our religion that we are what we eat. Just like if I eat a donut every day, I'm going to essentially have a donut around my waistline. Okay, so I'm sure Jalel's got some pictures of me eating some donuts somewhere that he's going to blackmail me with. But spiritually as well, and that's one of the reasons why the Sharia had prohibited consuming certain foods. So take it seriously. Take it seriously, and again, do the best you can. And then also, we have to get out of this mode of, like I said, we become so accustomed to just having everything at our fingertips, and that's not productive. That does not produce strong character. And realize if we're going to be just to ourselves, because we can make up any excuses we want, or this wasn't available, or that wasn't available. On the day of judgment, it's you alone that's going to stand in front of Allah Azza wa Jal. Those excuses that were not legitimate are all going to go away. And so just always remember that when you have to stand in front of Allah, you say, oh, but this was, I didn't have the opportunity, but I gave you the opportunity. I gave you the solutions. Did you follow it? I'll just give you a quick example. There was somebody I knew that was wanting to leave Islam. And they said, because I read all this online and I read this in this book I said, oh, slow down. How many hours would you say that you invested in reading about these questionable and doubtful things, what's called shubuhat in Islam and in your religion? Oh, hours. I can't count how many. I said, okay, how many hours did you invest in reading the Quran or reading books of the religion or asking people of knowledge? None. Is that justice?
Gotta go to the source.
Is that fair?
Yeah.
Academically speaking, is that fair? So the same concept. If you're willing to invest in looking at all other alternatives than what we have and in our own religion, then remember that you have to be just to yourself.
Yeah.
So
it's only you. It's only you in that grave, and it's only you in front of Allah on the day of judgment. So in your heart.
Exactly. May Allah keep us all safe on that day and in the next life and enter us into paradise, inshallah.
Abbas, one last point I want to make, and it's not about halal, but it's about something that's equally important. You got an audience out there, whether you choose to recognize it or not. For everyone that's listening out there, let's remember our dua for those that are suffering and those that are oppressed, and make sure that we remember the importance of that in everything that we do.
I mean,
I'm so sorry, Abbas. I don't want to keep adding points, but this was part of what I was saying. Yes, the Muslim consumer, in the end of the day, has the true power. Yeah. In the capitalistic society that we live in, if a person really wants change, it's not the certifier that has the influence. Believe me, they don't. Not as much as people think. If a Muslim truly wants change, whether it's I want only hand slaughtered, okay, or whatever it might be, it's the Muslim that has to push for it, that has to use their buying power in order to actually implement change.
That's beautiful. That means you, listeners, each and every one of you.
That's right. That's right.
Help us help you, basically.
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. That's beautiful, beautiful closing reflections.
Yes, better.
We are excited to continue exploring the halal industry from various angles throughout Season 3, so stay tuned for more.
Thank you so much for tuning in to the Artistic Foodies. Before we go, show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts.
Be sure to find us on Facebook and Instagram to stay tuned for more episodes as well as bonus content. You can also have access to all of our episodes at theartisticfoodies.com.
This podcast has been brought to you by HalalFest Inc. and GAMA, Gathering All Muslim Artists.